The empire unravels. The loss of India was not the end, it was the beginning of the end. Once the jewels slipped away, the rest of the crown trembled. Across the empire, from Africa's coastlines to Asia's jungles, people who had long bowed to Britain began to rise. The unraveling had begun, and Britain could do nothing to stop the tide. The 1950s and 60s became an age of fire, the fire of rebellion, of speeches, of marches, of wars. The empire, once painted red across a quarter of the globe, began to shrink with shocking speed. Every year, another colony demanded freedom. Every year, the Union Jack was lowered in yet another capital. Africa was the heart of this storm. For decades, Britain had drawn borders on maps, carving nations without thought for tribes, languages, or cultures. Now, those borders became prisons people longed to break. Ghana struck first in 1957, becoming the first African colony to win independence. The Gold Coast no longer belonged to Britain, it belonged to Africa. Ghana's triumph was a spark. Across the continent, movements swelled. Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, the names came one after another. What Britain had once claimed as eternal dominion dissolved in a wave of freedom. In a single generation, Africa was no longer an empire's playground, it was a continent of nations. But freedom did not come peacefully everywhere. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising turned the land into a battlefield. Villages burned, thousands died, and Britain's once proud empire revealed its brutality again, setting up camps and crushing rebels with iron fists. But even in blood, the tide could not be turned. Kenya would be free. In Malaya, Britain fought a bitter guerrilla war against communist fighters in the jungles. Soldiers marched, helicopters whirred, yet still Britain knew this was not victory, only delay. The colonies could no longer be chained by force. Britain was bleeding money, soldiers, and legitimacy. The unraveling was unstoppable. The Middle East, too, slipped away. Egypt, once the crown of Britain's control through the Suez Canal, erupted in nationalism. In 1956, when Britain tried to reassert its grip during the Suez Crisis, the world watched as America and the Soviet Union forced Britain to back down. It was humiliation. The empire was exposed as powerless before the new giants. The Suez Crisis was more than defeat, it was revelation. The British people saw, for the first time, that their empire was truly dead. The illusion of greatness shattered. No longer the world's policeman, no longer the master of seas, Britain had become a follower, not a leader. And so, more colonies broke away. Cyprus in the Mediterranean, Jamaica in the Caribbean, Malaysia in Asia. Year after year, independence ceremonies filled the world's headlines. Union Jacks came down, new flags rose, and Britain's global shadow shrank into the distance. For some in Britain, the losses were painful, a tearing away of pride. For others, it was relief. The empire had been costly, heavy, draining. Without it, perhaps Britain could breathe again. But identity was the wound that lingered. What was Britain without empire? The question haunted every departure. Even as it let go, Britain tried to reshape the story. Independence was not framed as loss, but as gift, as if Britain, generous and noble, had given freedom rather than been forced to surrender it. Speeches spoke of friendship, of partnership, of the new, commonwealth of nations. But beneath the polite words lay bitterness and denial. The unraveling was not only political, it was personal. Families of colonists returned to Britain, carrying memories of lands they had called home for generations. Soldiers came back with scars, both physical and invisible. Immigrants arrived from former colonies, changing the face of Britain itself. The empire's collapse was not distant. It walked through the streets of London. Yet not all ended cleanly. In Rhodesia, white settlers resisted, declaring independence unilaterally rather than accept black majority rule. Conflict flared, lasting decades. In South Africa, apartheid thrived, a shadow of empire's racial legacy. Freedom was coming, but slowly, painfully, unevenly. By the 1970s, the empire had collapsed in substance, if not in name. What had taken centuries to build unraveled in mere decades. Africa was independent. Asia was gone. The Caribbean was free. The Union Jack, once planted in every corner of the earth, now waved over an island nation and scattered remnants. But even those remnants were fragile. Hong Kong loomed as the final jewel, its neon lights a reminder of Britain's last great prize in the East. The world wondered, would Britain cling to it forever, or would it too slip away? The question was left hanging, suspense building toward a future reckoning. The unraveling also reshaped Britain's role in the world. No longer an empire, it turned to Europe for partnership, joining what would become the European Union. It clung to America for protection, becoming the junior partner in a special relationship. The empire was gone, but Britain was trying to find a new skin. At home, the myth of empire lingered. Films, school books, and parades spoke of glory, of adventure, of the time when Britain ruled the waves. Yet, the truth was known. The empire had not ended in glory, but in retreat. It had not gifted freedom. It had been forced to surrender it. The unraveling left scars, not only abroad, but within Britain itself. Debates raged over immigration, race, and identity. Former subjects of empire became citizens of Britain, creating a multicultural nation. The empire was gone, but its legacy lived on in every street, every accent, every corner shop. The empire's end was not one event, but a slow collapse. Each independence a stitch ripped from the fabric until the whole garment fell apart. The unraveling was chaotic, bloody, incomplete. Yet it was irreversible. The empire that had once been eternal was no more. But even as the colonies slipped away, Britain sought to prove it was still powerful. And in one last desperate moment, it tried on windswept islands in the South Atlantic, in a war few expected, where an old lion bared its teeth once more. In the next chapter, we witness the last stand, the Falklands War, Britain's fleeting illusion of empire reborn. The last stand by the early 1980s, Britain was no longer an empire, but a memory of one. The red on world maps had faded, the colonies had gone, and the nation seemed destined for quiet decline. Yet in 1982, in one of history's strangest twists, Britain would be thrust back into the spotlight, a final roar from a lion long thought toothless. The spark came from the South Atlantic, the Falkland Islands, a cold, windswept archipelago with more sheep than people. Few in Britain could even place it on a map. Yet when Argentina invaded in April 1982, it ignited a conflict that would test Britain's resolve, its pride, and its lingering ghost of empire. For Argentina, the islands, which they called the Malvinas, were a symbol of unfinished history, taken by Britain in 1833. For Britain, they were scraps of an empire barely remembered, but still legally and emotionally theirs. Neither side was willing to yield. The stage was set for a war that seemed both absurd and inevitable. When Argentine troops stormed the islands, the world expected Britain to accept defeat. How could a small, declining nation, thousands of miles away, hope to retake distant rocks in the freezing South Atlantic? Surely Britain would protest, but nothing more. Surely the empire was too dead to fight. But Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher saw things differently. To her, surrender would be national humiliation, proof that Britain was finished. Victory, however, could revive pride, restore power, and silence doubters. With icy resolve, she ordered the unthinkable: a naval task force to sail 8,000 miles to war. The fleet that left Britain was a ghost of what once had been. No longer the massive armadas of empire, but a slimmed-down navy stretched to its limit. Yet, as the ships sailed, the old echoes returned: Union Jacks snapping in the wind, sailors standing at attention, the nation watching with pounding hearts. Britain was going to war again. The journey itself was epic, a voyage across oceans, through storms, and into the unknown. Every mile carried danger. Could Britain really project power so far from home? Could an island nation that once ruled the waves still fight at the edge of the world? The question loomed like thunder over the sea. When the fighting began, it was brutal. Argentine planes screamed low over the waves, striking British ships with deadly precision. The HMS Sheffield, a proud destroyer, was hit by an Exocet missile and sank. The news shocked Britain. This was no parade, but a deadly war. Blood had been spilled, and the nation held its breath. Every ship lost, every sailor killed, reminded Britain of its fragility. Yet every victory, an enemy plane downed, a beach secured, revived the old pride. The battles of the South Atlantic became not just about land, but about identity. Could Britain still stand tall? Could it still command respect? The landings on the islands were scenes of fire and chaos. Marines stormed beaches under freezing winds, advancing through bogs and mountains. Night battles raged in the dark, bayonets flashing, artillery thundering. The war was raw, primitive, and unforgiving. And yet, step by step, Britain pushed forward. At Goose Green, one of the most decisive clashes, British forces faced fierce resistance. The fight lasted through the night, with every yard of ground soaked in blood and grit. But by dawn, the Union Jack flew again, and morale surged. Britain was proving, to the world and to itself, that it was not yet finished. The Argentine soldiers were young, often poorly supplied, and many were conscripts. Yet they fought with determination, believing the islands were their homeland. Against them stood seasoned British professionals, hardened by training and purpose. The war became a duel, not just of armies, but of wills. In London, Thatcher's reputation hung on the outcome. Victory would cement her as the Iron Lady. Defeat would end her government. The war was as political as it was military, and every headline, every broadcast, became ammunition in a battle for Britain's soul. Weeks of bloodshed led to the final advance on Port Stanley, the island's capital. Soldiers trudged through mud and freezing rain, each step bringing them closer to the endgame. The tension was unbearable. Would Argentina fight to the last? Would Britain risk everything in one last gamble? Then came the climax. British forces surrounded Stanley. Argentine defenses crumbled. White flags appeared on the horizon. The war was over. After 74 days of conflict, Britain had retaken the Falklands. The Union Jack was raised once more, fluttering defiantly in the cold South Atlantic wind. The victory electrified Britain. Crowds cheered in the streets. Bells rang. For the first time in decades, the nation felt proud, powerful, united. Thatcher's approval soared, her place in history secured. The empire might be gone, but for a fleeting moment, Britain felt like it still mattered. Yet beneath the triumph lay shadows. The war had cost lives, shattered families, and revealed Britain's vulnerabilities. The victory was real, but temporary. Britain could no longer rule the world. It could only defend fragments. The Falklands War was less a rebirth than a last desperate breath. Still, the illusion was powerful. For years afterward, politicians invoked the Falklands as proof that Britain remained strong. The empire was gone, yes, but perhaps its spirit lived on in courage, in sacrifice, in the willingness to fight. It was not empire restored, but empire remembered. And so the Falklands became more than islands, they became symbols. Symbols of defiance, of pride, of one last stand. Britain had shown it could still bare its teeth. But the truth lingered. This was not the roar of a young lion rising, but the growl of an old one refusing to die quietly. Yet while Britain celebrated, deeper questions gnawed at its soul. What was left after empire? What role could it play in a world dominated by America and the Soviet Union? In the next chapter, we explore empire's ghosts, the haunting legacies left behind, not only abroad, but in Britain itself. Empire's ghosts. When the Union Jack was lowered across colonies, the empire didn't simply vanish, it left ghosts. Invisible chains of history bound Britain to lands it no longer ruled. Economies, borders, wars, and cultures bore the fingerprints of imperial rule, and Britain itself carried scars it could never escape. The most haunting legacy was violence. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, Britain's exit left fractured nations stitched together by colonial borders. Arbitrary lines carved by distant rulers forced tribes, religions, and rivals into uneasy marriages. When those unions erupted into conflict, the empire's shadow could always be seen. Consider the Middle East. Britain had drawn borders with a ruler's edge, creating Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine with little regard for ancient divisions. When turmoil engulfed the region decades later, the ghosts of empire whispered through every headline, every explosion, every cry for justice. In India, independence brought joy, but also horror. Britain's hurried withdrawal carved a new nation, Pakistan, out of the old. The partition tore communities apart, sparking one of the bloodiest migrations in human history. Millions fled, millions suffered, millions died, the empire's final gift to the subcontinent. In Africa, Britain left nations raw and fragile. Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, all struggled with corruption, tribalism, and civil wars that traced back to colonial exploitation. The empire had trained people to serve, not to govern. When independence came, many were left without the tools to rule themselves. Even where violence wasn't constant, inequality remained. The empire had built railways and ports, but not for the people, for extraction. Gold, diamonds, cotton, tea, all flowed outward. When the empire collapsed, the wealth was gone, but the systems of poverty remained, like broken machinery rusting in the sun. But the ghosts didn't haunt only the colonies. They haunted Britain itself. Immigrants arrived from the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, and Africa, drawn by the empire's promise. They came to rebuild the mother country after the Second World War. But instead of welcome, many found prejudice, poverty, and struggle. The Windrush generation, arriving from the Caribbean in the late 1940s, came to help Britain rise from the rubble. They built the railways, the hospitals, the buses. Yet decades later, many of their children would face discrimination, denied homes, jobs, and even citizenship. The ghosts of empire lingered in every insult, every locked door. Racism, rooted in centuries of colonial superiority, did not vanish with independence. It seeped into Britain's streets, schools, and politics. The empire had once justified itself by claiming to civilize others. That poison lingered, warping identities, shaping divisions that simmered beneath the surface. Cultural clashes became another ghost. Britain had once exported its language, laws, and values across the world. Now, those same cultures flowed back into Britain, reshaping the island itself. Curry houses filled London streets, reggae thundered in clubs, mosques rose alongside cathedrals. For some, it was a renaissance. For others, a threat. The empire also left economic ghosts. London had once been the beating heart of global trade, pumping wealth into Britain. After the empire's fall, industries collapsed. Shipyards closed. Factories went silent. Mining towns sank into despair. Without its colonies to feed it, Britain struggled to find a new purpose. And yet, paradoxically, the empire's ghost also offered power. Former colonies joined the Commonwealth, a network of nations bound by history, trade, and culture. Though no longer rulers, Britain still carried influence. The empire was dead, but the Commonwealth was its echo, a softer ghost of what had been. In politics, too, the empire's shadow stretched long. Britain's seat at the UN Security Council, its nuclear weapons, its global reputation, all relics of empire. Without its imperial past, could Britain have held such sway? Perhaps not. The empire's ghosts still whispered in the halls of power. Yet ghosts never rest quietly. In Ireland, Britain's empire had always been close, and the conflict in Northern Ireland, the Troubles, erupted in the late 20th century. Bombings, assassinations, riots, all rooted in centuries of domination. The empire had left its deepest scars on the land closest to home. Everywhere Britain turned, the empire followed. From refugee crises to border disputes, from terrorism to trade, its past shaped its present. The empire was gone, but it haunted every decision, every relationship, every attempt to define Britain's place in the modern world. Even memory itself was a ghost. Statues of imperial heroes stood in city squares, their bronze faces smiling down. Streets bore the names of colonizers, slave traders, and generals. For some, they were history to be honored. For others, wounds to be erased. The debate over memory kept the ghosts alive. The British Museum, filled with treasures taken from across the globe, stood as perhaps the greatest ghost of all. Elgin's marbles, the Rosetta Stone, the Benin bronze, artifacts seized in conquest, displayed as trophies. Visitors marveled, but nations demanded their return. The empire lived on in glass cases and whispered controversies. And so Britain stood in a paradox. It had lost its empire, but could never escape it. Every street, every accent, every conflict carried its weight. To be British was to be haunted by both pride and shame, by triumph and guilt, by glory and grief. But ghosts don't just haunt, they teach. For some, the empire's legacy was a reminder of injustice to be overcome. For others, it was proof of strength to be remembered. Britain's struggle with its ghosts would define its future, how to reconcile what it was with what it hoped to be. And as Britain wrestled with its past, a new world order emerged. The Cold War had ended. The United States towered, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Europe united. Where did that leave Britain? A ghost of empire caught between giants. In the next chapter, we uncover the cold shadow and Britain's fight to remain relevant in a world no longer its own. The cold shadow, the guns of World War II had fallen silent, but for Britain, the peace was uneasy. Across the globe, new giants had risen. The United States and the Soviet Union loomed like titans, their rivalry splitting the world in two. Britain, once the master of oceans, now found itself caught in the long, chilling shadow of a new kind of war. The Cold War was not fought with muskets or cannons, nor with lines of red-coated soldiers marching through colonies. It was fought in whispers, in secrets, in the deadly silence of nuclear arsenals waiting to ignite. Britain, though diminished, clung to relevance with trembling hands, desperate not to fade into obscurity. London was no longer the center of the world. Washington and Moscow called the shots. Yet Britain's leaders refused to admit the empire's twilight. They branded their nation the third force, neither America nor Russia, but something uniquely British, a bridge between worlds. The truth, however, was harsher. Britain was leaning on America to survive. The United States became Britain's protector, its wealth and military shielding the island from Soviet threats. In exchange, Britain gave loyalty, bases, and intelligence. The once mighty empire now acted as junior partner, and though the phrase was never spoken aloud, it was painfully understood. Nuclear weapons became Britain's lifeline. The bomb was the only thing that allowed Britain to stand among giants. Without it, the nation risked being dismissed as a fading power clinging to past glories. The mushroom cloud, horrifying and final, became Britain's shield against irrelevance. But the Cold War was not just about weapons. It was about influence. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, newly independent nations became battlegrounds for ideology. Would they embrace democracy and capitalism or fall to communism? Britain, once their ruler, now found itself scrambling to influence the very states it had abandoned. The Middle East, in particular, became a theater of shadows. Oil had replaced gold as the prize of empires, and Britain was desperate to hold on to it. Yet time and again, Britain's grip slipped. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was the breaking point, a disaster that exposed Britain's weakness to the world. In Suez, Britain, alongside France and Israel, tried to seize the canal from Egypt's bold leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. It was meant to be a show of strength, a reminder that Britain still ruled the waves. Instead, it became a humiliation. Under pressure from America and the Soviet Union, Britain was forced to withdraw. The empire's corpse was dragged into the open for all to see. The Suez Crisis shattered illusions. For centuries, Britain had dictated global events. Now, it was Washington that decided its fate. To many, Suez was the moment Britain truly lost its empire, not with a bang of independence, but with the quiet humiliation of obedience. Yet Britain still clung to influence through intelligence. MI6, once famed for cloak and dagger colonial work, now played its role in the shadow wars of spies. From Berlin tunnels to Moscow defections, Britain traded secrets with America, ensuring that the island remained valuable, even if not dominant. At home, the Cold War seeped into everyday life. Sirens wailed in practice drills. Families were told where to hide in case of nuclear attack. Schools whispered of fallout shelters. The empire had once promised wealth and dominion. Now, the promise was survival beneath the threat of annihilation. Culturally, too, the Cold War reshaped Britain. American films, music, and products flooded its markets, replacing imperial pride with Hollywood glamour and jazz rhythms. Britain was no longer exporting its culture across the globe. Instead, it was importing America's dreams. But Britain was not without its own fire. The swinging 60s, with the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Carnaby Street, reminded the world that the island still had power, not in armies or fleets, but in art, music, and imagination. Britain could no longer conquer territories, but it could still conquer hearts. Meanwhile, Europe was transforming. Nations once crushed under war were rising through cooperation. The European Economic Community promised shared prosperity. Britain hesitated, torn between its imperial past and its European future. When it finally joined in the 1970s, it was late, no longer a leader, but a follower. In this new world, Britain's ghostly empire lingered in every decision. Immigration from former colonies reshaped its cities. Trade with the Commonwealth kept links alive. Military bases scattered across the globe gave the illusion of reach. Britain was no longer an empire, but it pretended to wear the empire's clothes. Yet for all its struggles, Britain retained one weapon the giants did not: history. It had survived invasions, revolutions, and wars. The nation adapted like few others could. And though it stood in the Cold War as a shadow of itself, that shadow was still long and deeply etched across the world. Still, doubts grew. Was Britain destined to become nothing more than a relic, a museum piece of empire and monarchy? Or could it forge a new identity, not as a ruler, but as a partner in a new age of alliances? The Cold War was a battle for survival, not just of nations, but of pride. Each crisis, Berlin, Cuba, Vietnam, reminded Britain of its limits. It no longer decided the course of the world. Instead, it reacted, sometimes with courage, sometimes with hesitation. The empire's sun had set, but Britain still searched for a dawn. The Cold War's end in 1991 brought both relief and dread. The Soviet Union collapsed, the United States stood triumphant, and Britain was left to ask, what now? Without the Cold War to anchor it, the island's role in the world was uncertain once more. The ghost of empire whispered, but offered no answers. And so Britain, stripped of empire, stripped of Cold War, entered a new age. The question loomed larger than ever. Could it still matter? Could it still fight? The answer would come in Chapter 15, The Last Stand, where Britain sought one final moment to prove that its flag still meant power, even if only for a fleeting battle on distant islands. The Last Stand by the early 1980s, Britain's empire was a memory, and its global influence had dwindled. Yet on a cluster of wind-battered islands in the South Atlantic, an unlikely spark would ignite. The Falklands, tiny, remote, almost forgotten, became the stage for Britain's final stand as a global military power. The Falklands were home to just a few thousand people, mostly sheep farmers. They were British citizens, proud of their heritage, but their home was thousands of miles from London. To many in Britain, the islands seemed insignificant, but to Argentina, they were Las Malvinas, stolen land that had to be reclaimed. In 1982, Argentina's military junta, desperate to distract its people from economic collapse and dictatorship, launched a bold gamble. Argentine forces stormed the islands, planting their flag in defiance of Britain. It was a provocation few thought Britain could or would answer. For decades, Britain had been retreating from the world stage, abandoning colonies, closing bases, and downsizing its navy. Many assumed the Falklands would be the same, another withdrawal, another concession to the tide of history. But this time, Britain's answer was different. Margaret Thatcher, Britain's Prime Minister, refused to surrender. Her government declared the islands would be retaken, no matter the cost. It was a gamble as great as Argentina's, for failure would shatter Britain's last illusion of power. The empire was gone, but pride still burned. The Royal Navy, once ruler of the seas, was hastily assembled. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and troop ships set sail, a fleet bound for war across 8,000 miles of ocean. Few believed it could succeed. Britain was far, Argentina was close, and the odds seemed stacked against the old empire. Yet as the task force pushed south, a wave of national unity swept Britain. The newspapers thundered with headlines of defiance. Crowds gathered to cheer departing ships. The ghosts of Trafalgar and Nelson seemed to whisper once more, as if Britain's naval soul had awakened from its long sleep. The war began in icy seas. British submarines prowled beneath the waves, striking with deadly precision. The sinking of Argentina's cruiser, the General Belgrano, shocked the world. More than 300 sailors perished, and suddenly, Argentina's navy was paralyzed with fear. The sea, once again, belonged to Britain. But the skies told another story. Argentine pilots, brave and desperate, launched daring attacks on Britain's ships. Exocet missiles screamed across the water, slamming into British vessels. The HMS Sheffield burned, men trapped inside. Britain was reminded that this war would not be won without sacrifice. The battles were raw, brutal, and unforgiving. Soldiers slogged through freezing mud, carrying heavy packs across bleak landscapes. Helicopters fought winds, supplies faltered, and every mile gained felt like blood wrung from stone. This was no glorious empire march. This was survival. Yet, step by step, Britain advanced. Special forces struck behind enemy lines. Marines clashed in the mountains. The Union Jack, lowered in shame weeks before, now seemed destined to rise again. The war was not about land alone. It was about proving Britain still had teeth. The world watched with fascination. Could a fated empire still project power halfway across the globe? Could Britain, the once mighty lion, still roar? Each battle answered with fire and steel. Yes, but at great cost. Goose Green became a name etched in blood. A fierce battle where British troops, outnumbered and exhausted, pressed forward against Argentine defenses. Victory came not from numbers, but from grit, determination, and refusal to yield. It was the spirit of the empire's past reborn, if only for a moment. The climax came in the hills overlooking Stanley, the Falklands capital. Under freezing skies, British soldiers advanced through gunfire and darkness, bayonets fixed. It was savage, hand to hand, as close to the old wars of empire as the modern age would ever see. And when dawn broke, the Union Jack fluttered once more above the town. On June 14, 1982, Argentina surrendered. The Falklands were British again. Bells rang in London, crowds cheered, and Thatcher declared victory. For a fleeting moment, it was as though the empire had returned. The lion had proven it still had claws. But beneath the triumph lay truth. The Falklands were not India, not Africa, not Canada or Australia. They were a speck, defended at great risk, won at great cost. Britain had shown strength, yes, but the victory was not an empire reborn. It was a last, defiant roar before silence. Yet the war mattered. It restored Britain's pride, cemented Thatcher's rule, and proved the nation could still fight if provoked. More than that, it sent a message to allies and enemies alike. Though Britain's empire had crumbled, it was not yet ready to vanish from history. The Falklands became a symbol, a myth of endurance. For veterans, it was sacrifice carved into memory. For the nation, it was proof that Britain, even small and diminished, could still stand tall in the face of challenge. The empire's shadow lingered in every Union Jack that waved. But the question remained, was the Falklands a true revival or a final echo? Empires often die not with silence, but with desperate, dramatic gasps, flashes of power before the inevitable fade. The war left Britain standing proud, but it could not reverse the tide of history. The lion had roared one last time in the South Atlantic, but across the world, its shadow was fading faster than ever. The colonies were gone, the empire dissolved, and yet, its legacy would not vanish so easily. In Chapter 16, Empire's Ghosts, we confront the aftershocks, how Britain's empire continues to shape the world long after its fall. Empire's Ghosts, the Union Jack no longer waved above continents, but the British Empire was not gone. It lingered in borders drawn in haste, in languages imposed, in railways stretching across continents, and in memories that would not die. The empire's ghosts lived on, silent, powerful, and impossible to exorcise. Look to Africa, where lines drawn by British officials carved tribes, cultures, and nations apart. Boundaries made in London, with rulers on maps, created states that still struggle with conflict today. In those lines, the empire whispers, reminding the world of its careless hand. In South Asia, Britain's retreat left behind a wound that still bleeds. Partition. The hurried division of India and Pakistan in 1947 sparked chaos, driving millions from their homes, leaving rivers of blood in its wake. Families torn apart, communities destroyed. This was not empire's glory, but empire's ghost, stalking generations. In the Middle East, Britain's fingerprints can be traced across deserts and oil fields. Promises made and broken to Arabs and Jews alike. The seeds of conflict were sown by imperial deals and betrayals, and their harvest still burns in wars fought decades later. Even in victory, the empire's ghosts left scars. The railways, schools, and laws Britain boasted of were double-edged swords. They modernized, yes, but they also erased traditions, crushed local authority, and created dependence. Progress built not for the people, but for the empire's hunger. Language itself became a ghost of empire. English spread to every corner of the globe, from Lagos to Delhi, Sydney to Kingston. Today, it is the language of business, science, and diplomacy, but behind it lies the story of conquest. Every word spoken is an echo of imperial rule. The empire also lived on in wealth, or rather, in the imbalance of it. Britain had drained colonies of resources, leaving some nations rich in culture but poor in infrastructure. The gold, the cotton, the tea, the oil, much of it fueled Britain's rise, while leaving others shackled in poverty. Even in culture, the ghost lingers. Cricket matches in India, reggae music from Jamaica, tea in Kenya, English courts in Hong Kong, fragments of empire stitched into the fabric of daily life. What was once a symbol of power has now become memory, tradition, sometimes pride, sometimes pain. For Britain itself, the ghosts took another form. Immigration from former colonies brought new cultures into the heart of the old empire. London's streets filled with voices from across the Commonwealth. The empire had gone, but its people had come home. Britain was no longer the ruler of the world, but a mosaic built from its past. This created tensions as well as richness. Racism, inequality, and resentment simmered in the empire's wake. For some in Britain, the empire was still remembered as glory. For others, it was remembered as chains. The ghosts were not only global, they haunted Britain's own identity. The Commonwealth of Nations became another echo, a voluntary club of former colonies, bound not by force but by history. Some saw it as cooperation, others as lingering influence. It was empire reimagined, softer, less violent, but still a reminder of the crown that once commanded. The legal systems Britain left behind still shape the world. Common law courts in Asia and Africa, parliamentary democracy modeled on Westminster, institutions forged in London now govern distant nations. But were these gifts or shackles disguised as gifts? The answer depends on who you ask. Even sport carried the empire's shadow. Cricket, rugby, and football became global passions, born in Britain and spread through conquest. Every time a World Cup is played, every time a test match takes the field, the empire's ghost smiles, knowing its cultural DNA has not died. The darker legacy remained, too. The stories of oppression, famine, slavery, and plunder. In museums across Britain, artifacts from Africa and Asia sit in glass cases, treasures taken, not given. Each one a silent witness to empire's theft, each one a ghost demanding to be returned. The empire also haunts memory. In former colonies, stories of resistance and suffering are passed from grandparents to children. In Britain, myths of benevolence and glory are still told. The truth is harder, heavier, an empire built on both progress and pain, pride and blood. The very idea of power shifted because of the empire. America, China, India, Africa, all contend with systems shaped by Britain's rise and fall. Wars, alliances, trade routes, currencies, they bear the fingerprints of imperial hands that once gripped the globe. And yet, the ghost is not only pain, it is also shared identity. A Nigerian poet writing in English, an Indian doctor working in London, a Caribbean musician shaping global sound. The empire fractured, but it also fused, leaving a world more connected, sometimes by force, sometimes by choice. For some, the ghost is a curse. For others, a strange kind of inheritance. The empire's fall did not erase its shadow. It stretched, grew, and adapted long after the last colony was free. To live in today's world is, in some way, to live in the ghost of Britain's empire. But ghosts do not rest forever. They stir questions. Who should repair the damage? Should Britain apologize or pay reparations? Should the past be celebrated or condemned? These questions ignite debate in classrooms, parliaments, and protests, proving the empire is not history. It is still alive in memory. The British Empire may have fallen, but its shadows walk beside us even now. Borders, languages, conflicts, and cultures all carry its weight. Yet one question remains: how did the empire's collapse change Britain itself? In Chapter 17, The Cold Shadow, we witness how the rise of America and the Soviet Union finally buried Britain's dreams of dominance and left it struggling to find its place in a new world. The cold shadow, the guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, but Britain's victory was hollow. The empire had survived, yes, but at a price so heavy it nearly crushed the nation. Behind the cheering crowds and waving flags lay a grim truth. Britain was broke, exhausted, and no longer the master of the world it once claimed. In the ruins of Europe, two new powers rose. To the west, the United States, wealthy, untouched by war's devastation, armed with the atomic bomb. To the east, the Soviet Union, vast, ruthless, and determined to spread its ideology across the globe. Together, they cast a shadow so immense that Britain's fading empire shrank beneath it. Britain had once ruled through its navy. Rule, Britannia. Britannia rules the waves, had been more than a song, it was a truth. But now, American carriers patrolled the seas, while Soviet submarines prowled the depths. Britain's fleet, once unrivaled, was suddenly obsolete. At home, rationing continued years after the war. Families struggled to find bread, meat, even tea. The people who had endured bombs and blackouts were now enduring shortages in peace. How could a nation that claimed to rule the world not even feed its own? The empire's crown glittered less with every hungry stomach. The Americans offered loans, lifelines that tied Britain's survival to Washington. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, but it also made clear America, not Britain, was the new banker of the world. The empire's wealth was gone, and in its place stood debt. In Asia, Britain faced a storm it could not stop. India had broken free. Burma and Ceylon followed. The jewel in the crown was gone, and without it, the empire's grip loosened everywhere. Britain's prestige crumbled in whispers and revolts across its remaining colonies. Meanwhile, the Soviets challenged Britain in another way, through ideology. Communism spread like wildfire, promising freedom from colonial masters. To millions under British rule, Moscow's voice seemed more attractive than London's. The empire was not just shrinking, it was being undermined from within. Even the Commonwealth, meant to soften the empire's collapse, revealed Britain's weakness. Former colonies joined, but they looked more to America for protection, or to the Soviets for opportunity. The Commonwealth was a family in name, but Britain was no longer the patriarch. Then came Suez, 1956. Britain and France, determined to control the vital canal, launched a secret invasion of Egypt. But when America opposed it, Britain was forced to back down in humiliation. The message was clear. Britain was no longer the decider of global affairs, Washington was. The Suez Crisis was Britain's true moment of reckoning. Once, no nation dared to defy its will. Now, a single word from America forced its retreat. The illusion of empire was shattered. Britain had gone from global leader to junior partner in less than a decade. Inside Britain, this new reality was hard to accept. Many clung to memories of glory, Trafalgar, Waterloo, Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. But young voices asked a harsher question. What did empire really bring us? Pride or ruin? The debate itself showed the shadow of decline. The Cold War forced Britain into difficult choices. It joined NATO, aligning with America against the Soviet Union. But in every decision, Britain was the follower, not the leader. The empire had once dictated the world's politics. Now it could only react. Nuclear weapons offered a flicker of relevance. Britain built its own bomb, determined not to be left behind. Yet even here, it depended on American technology. The image of independence was carefully painted, but the truth was obvious. Britain's power was borrowed, not earned. Culturally, Britain still held influence: music, literature, fashion. The Beatles would conquer America in the 1960s, but this was cultural empire, not political. The days of commanding armies and ruling colonies were fading into sepia photographs and dusty schoolbooks. Across the colonies, liberation spread like wildfire. Africa erupted in independence movements. Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, one after another, flags were lowered and new nations were born. Each one was another nail in the coffin of the empire. Britain celebrated them as progress, but the truth was loss. At the United Nations, Britain's voice grew smaller. Once the empire had spoken for continents. Now it was one voice among many. The new giants, America and the USSR, thundered across the chamber, while Britain's words were echoes of a past no one feared anymore. Still, Britain clung to symbols. The Queen, the royal ceremonies, the pageantry of empire. But these were masks covering emptiness. The empire was gone, the colonies were leaving, and the shadow of decline stretched longer with each passing year. By the 1970s, the empire was no longer a reality, but a memory. Britain entered the European community, seeking relevance in Europe after losing it across the globe. This was not the step of a ruler. It was the step of a nation desperate for belonging. The Cold War had remade the world, and in this new order, Britain was not first, not second, but third, a fading power caught between giants. Once the empire had ruled the waves. Now it floated in the wake of American carriers and Soviet submarines. The shadow of empire hung heavy over Britain. But some refused to let go. They longed for a moment to prove that Britain still mattered, that the empire's spirit had not died. And in the 1980s, they would find it in a war fought thousands of miles away, over tiny islands few had ever heard of. In Chapter 18, The Last Stand, the Empire would roar one final time, and then fall silent forever. The Last Stand, it was the spring of 1982. A storm brewed in the South Atlantic, not from nature, but from ambition and desperation. The Falkland Islands, a cluster of windswept, sparsely populated rocks at the edge of the world, suddenly became the stage for Britain's last imperial war. For decades, few in Britain even remembered the Falklands existed. They were relics of empire, remote, costly to maintain, and strategically insignificant. But for Argentina, the islands, known as the Malvinas, were seen as stolen land, a symbol of colonial injustice waiting to be reclaimed. When Argentine forces invaded in April 1982, the world barely noticed at first. But in London, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher saw something far greater at stake. To her, this was not about sheep pastures and fishing waters. This was about honor, pride, and the ghost of empire. Thatcher was a leader under fire at home. The economy was collapsing, unemployment soared, and her popularity was sinking fast. But the invasion gave her a chance to change the narrative. If she could defend Britain's territory, she could defend Britain's legacy. Failure was unthinkable. And so, against the odds, Britain prepared to fight a war nearly 8,000 miles from its shores. The Royal Navy assembled a task force, carriers, destroyers, submarines, a fleet that looked like a ghost of the empire's past. The nation held its breath, unsure if this gamble was madness or destiny. The world doubted Britain. America hesitated to support, Europe stayed quiet, and many asked the same question. How could a fading power project force so far away? The Falklands were not India, not Africa, not the riches of empire. But to Britain, they became everything. The first blood came quickly. The nuclear submarine HMS Conqueror sank the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano. Hundreds died in the freezing waters. The message was clear. Britain was not bluffing. The empire may be gone, but its navy still knew how to kill. Argentina struck back. Its jets screamed across the skies, sinking British ships with deadly precision. The destroyer Sheffield went down in flames. The carrier Invincible came under threat. Every loss reminded Britain of its vulnerability, of how close humiliation loomed. But Britain pressed forward. Royal Marines landed on the islands, slogging through mud, snow, and enemy fire. The battles were brutal, fought in conditions as harsh as the Empire's earliest campaigns. Goose Green, Mount Tumbledown, names that became etched in British memory. The war gripped the nation. For the first time in decades, Britons felt united in a cause that seemed larger than politics. Television showed images of flag-draped coffins, but also of soldiers raising the Union Jack. For many, it felt like a spark of the old empire's fire had returned. For Thatcher, victory was not just military, it was political salvation. Each step forward in the South Atlantic echoed back in Britain, turning her from embattled leader into the Iron Lady who would not yield. The Falklands became her war and her triumph. But the cost was high. Ships lay at the bottom of the ocean, young men buried in frozen soil. The war lasted just 10 weeks, but it bled resources and lives at a time when Britain could afford neither. Still, the nation swallowed the cost for the sake of pride. By June 1982, it was over. Argentine forces surrendered. The Union Jack flew once more over the Falklands. Britain erupted in celebration, cheering crowds, triumphant parades, and headlines declaring, "Britain is back." For a moment, it felt as though the empire's ghost had risen. But beneath the euphoria lay a sobering truth. The Falklands did not restore the empire. They did not return Britain to its throne. They were a symbolic victory, a temporary illusion that Britain still mattered in the same way it once had. To the world's superpowers, the war was little more than a regional squabble. The United States and Soviet Union barely blinked. While Britain celebrated, the Cold War thundered on, leaving no space for a fading empire to reclaim relevance. Yet for Britain itself, the Falklands meant everything. They were proof that the country could still project power, still fight, still win. The empire was dead, but its spirit lingered, not in colonies or conquests, but in the stubborn refusal to be forgotten. The Falklands became a strange paradox. They were both Britain's last stand as an empire and its first as a modern nation learning to live without one. The Union Jack still flew, but it flew over rocks at the end of the world, not over continents. Thatcher basked in the victory, her image forever tied to the war. But history would not be so kind. The Falklands were a pause in decline, not a reversal. Britain's global role continued to shrink, its empire now a memory growing dimmer with each passing year. Still, the war left echoes. It showed that even in decline, a nation could roar. It proved that the ghosts of empire were not easily exorcised, and it reminded the world, and Britain itself, that though the empire had fallen, the fight for identity was far from over. The Falklands were Britain's last imperial war, its final echo of global dominance. But once the cheering stopped, a deeper question remained. What happens after the empire is gone? In Chapter 19, Empire's Ghosts, we will uncover how the legacies of conquest, exploitation, and power still haunt Britain and the world long after the Union Jack was lowered across the colonies. Empire's Ghosts. The Union Jack no longer flew over 1/4 of the world, but the empire had not vanished, not truly. It lived on in borders hastily drawn, in nations struggling to define themselves, and in wounds that still bled generations later. The empire was dead in name, but its ghosts were everywhere. In Africa, those ghosts looked like lines on a map. Colonial officials had carved up the continent with rulers and pens, ignoring tribes, languages, and histories. When independence came, those artificial borders turned into fault lines, fueling wars and divisions that smolder even today. In India and Pakistan, the ghost of empire bled across partition. The British exit was rushed, chaotic, and careless. Millions were uprooted, millions more slaughtered in the frenzy of division. The subcontinent gained freedom, but the scars of partition still haunt every border skirmish and every cry of nationalism. The Middle East, too, carried the empire's fingerprints. Promises made and broken, territories carved and abandoned, rulers installed and overthrown. From Palestine to Iraq, Britain left behind not stability, but confusion and resentment. Each conflict that erupted was a whisper of empire's unfinished business. But the ghosts were not only in blood and borders. They lived in language, in law, in institutions. English became the world's common tongue, the empire's most enduring weapon. Courts across Asia and Africa echoed with British-style justice systems, schools with British-style curricula. The empire's voice lingered in the everyday. Even the very idea of the Commonwealth was a ghost. Britain tried to dress it as friendship, as shared heritage, but to many, it looked like empire reborn under another name. Former colonies gathered under Britain's shadow, tied not by choice alone, but by the weight of history. In London, the empire's ghosts walked the streets in another form: migration. As colonies fell, their people came to Britain, seeking opportunity in the very heart of the empire that once ruled them. Jamaicans, Indians, Pakistanis, Africans, the empire was now at Britain's doorstep. But not all welcomed this return. Racism festered, fueled by the irony that Britain, which once prided itself on ruling the world, struggled to accept the world within its own borders. The ghosts of empire took the shape of tension in neighborhoods, clashes in politics, and questions of identity that still rage today. Economically, the empire's shadow lingered. Former colonies often found themselves trapped in patterns set by Britain, exporting raw materials, importing finished goods. Independence had come, but dependency remained, a subtle reminder that freedom was not the same as equality. Yet, some ghosts carried strange gifts. Cricket in India, Nigeria's parliamentary system, Hong Kong's legal traditions, relics of empire repurposed into tools of national pride. Former colonies reshaped imperial legacies, turning them from chains into weapons of their own. Still, the haunting was never equal. For some nations, Britain's exit left space for growth and innovation. For others, it left chaos, civil wars, and dictatorships. The empire's collapse was not a clean break, it was a slow unraveling, each strand tugging at future generations. And in Britain itself, the ghosts were two-faced. On one side, nostalgia, stories of glory, of when Britain ruled the waves. On the other, guilt, reminders of slavery, exploitation, and violence. The nation wrestled with its own memory, unsure whether to celebrate or condemn its past. Museums became mausoleums of empire. The British Museum's halls overflowed with artifacts taken from India, Egypt, Benin, and beyond. Each glittering object told two stories, one of beauty, one of theft. Returning them became a political battle, proof that ghosts could not be buried. Even food carried whispers of empire. Tea from India, curry from South Asia, sugar from the Caribbean. Britain's very identity was flavored by lands it once conquered. Every sip of tea was a taste of history, a reminder of how empire had seeped into the ordinary. But perhaps the most chilling ghost of all was power itself. The empire had created a world order centered on Europe, on whiteness, on wealth extracted from the rest. Even after decolonization, the system endured. Former colonies were independent, yet global power still tilted toward those who once ruled. And so, empire did not die, it mutated. It lived in trade deals, in financial systems, in military alliances. It lived in the very structure of globalization, where the echoes of conquest still dictated who won and who lost. For the descendants of the colonized, the ghosts were personal. Generations carried trauma, loss of language, loss of culture. Stories were silenced, rewritten by victors. The empire's shadow was not only political or economic, it was intimate, lived in families, passed down in silence and pain. Yet, resistance grew too. Writers, activists, historians, they dragged the ghosts into the light, demanding accountability, demanding recognition. Empire's legacy was no longer something to hide, but something to confront. The debate over Britain's past grew louder, sharper, unavoidable. Still, the haunting refused to end. Every border clash, every migration crisis, every argument about statues or reparations was proof that the Empire's story was not over. The British Empire was gone, but it had left fingerprints on the world too deep to erase. And so, the ghosts remain. They whisper in wars, in politics, in identity. The Empire's body is buried, but its shadow stretches across centuries. Yet one question lingers above all. Was the fall of the British Empire an end, or the beginning of something far more enduring? In Chapter 20, The Twist of Fate, we will confront the final revelation, how the Empire's death birthed a world still bound by its rules, and the chilling truth that the Empire never truly fell. The twist of fate, the British Empire, as history books tell us, ended with the lowering of flags, the independence ceremonies, the speeches of freedom. But history is never so clean, never so simple. What if the empire did not end at all? What if, in its death, it found a way to live on, not as a nation, but as a system? That is the twist of fate. Britain's empire fell on the surface, but beneath, it had already woven itself into the fabric of the modern world. The empires of the past ruled with armies and governors. This empire, reborn in shadow, ruled with finance, trade, and ideas. Consider the city of London, not just a city, but the beating heart of global finance. Long after the colonies vanished, the money kept flowing, investments spreading across continents. Britain no longer sent soldiers to occupy lands, but bankers, corporations, and deals that shaped nations just as effectively. And language, the softest, deadliest weapon of all. English became the language of business, diplomacy, science, and the internet. The empire no longer needed bayonets when its words had conquered the globe. The tongue of Shakespeare and Churchill became the world's passport. Education carried the same secret. From Delhi to Lagos, schools still taught British systems. Universities in London and Oxford became centers of power, shaping leaders who would go back to their nations carrying Britain's intellectual stamp. The empire had lost territory, but it had won minds. The Commonwealth, too, was more than nostalgia. It was soft power disguised as friendship, a network where Britain could still whisper in the ears of dozens of nations. A king no longer ruled them, but a subtle influence lingered, shaping alliances, shaping trade, shaping identity. Even America, the rebel child, carried Britain's imprint. Its legal traditions, its political culture, its very constitution bore the fingerprints of the mother country. And when America rose to replace Britain as the world's superpower, it carried forward an order that Britain had built. This was the final twist. The empire collapsed, yet its successor, the United States, extended the same system worldwide. Military bases, capitalism, English dominance, echoes of empire, now under a different flag. Britain's shadow stretched through America's rise. But the most chilling part was this: the empire's ghosts became invisible. People no longer saw them as empire, but as the way the world works. Global trade, the banking system, international law, all rooted in the empire's blueprint, yet accepted as natural, inevitable. The twist was not only in survival, but in disguise. The British Empire had vanished in name, but it had become the very skeleton of modern civilization. Its control was no longer obvious. It was hidden in contracts, currencies, and institutions. Take the time zones, the maps, the borders, all shaped by empire. The very way we imagine the world is through a lens the British helped create. The fall of the empire did not erase it. It merely locked its influence into the foundations of global life. And yet, Britain itself was no longer the master. It had unleashed a system that even it could not fully control. Power had shifted to America, to corporations, to global networks. Britain's empire had outlived Britain itself, like a ghost that no exorcism could banish. This twist of fate left a cruel irony. The empire, once built on conquest, now survived as culture, economy, and thought. The nations that had been conquered now lived in a world shaped by that conquest, whether they wished it or not. For those who celebrated independence, the realization was bitter. The chains had broken, but the imprint remained. To this day, when a child in Africa learns in English, when a politician in Asia studies law in London, when a nation borrows from Western banks, the empire whispers. The suspense builds here. Perhaps empires never truly die. Perhaps they only change form. Rome fell, yet its law and roads lived on. Britain fell, yet its systems endured. The fall of the British Empire was not an end, it was a transformation. And that is the chilling truth. The empire may have lost its crown, but it gained something far greater: invisibility. A hidden empire, one that no army could overthrow, because it was embedded in the way the world itself worked. The irony was sharpest in Britain itself. Once ruler of the world, now just another nation, its people often looked backward in longing. Yet outside, billions lived under the shadow of decisions Britain had made centuries before. The empire's ghost was everywhere, except in Britain's own reflection. This leaves us with the final, haunting question: did the British Empire ever really fall? Or does it live on in our schools, our governments, our economies, our very language, invisible, silent, yet powerful as ever? The story of the British Empire is told as rise and fall, glory and decline. But perhaps that is the greatest illusion of all. The twist of fate is that the empire did not collapse into dust. It dissolved into air. And in that form, it became immortal. And so, the tale ends where it began. A small island in the North Atlantic, casting a shadow far larger than itself. The empire is gone. And yet, it is everywhere. Its story is not history, but present. Its fall was not an ending, but a transformation. And its ghosts will haunt the world for centuries to come.